All right, Shabbos, say good morning. An incredible daf ahead of us today, beginning by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar. Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all the Shurim and Drushos this month in memory of Paul's grandmother, Dina Bas Pesach, his grandfather, Zechariah ben Zechariah, whose yard sites are in the month of Adar. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Kiva Noach and Karen Andrews from Eretz Yisrael. Such a beautiful sponsorship for the yard site of Karen's mother, Marsha Bas David Vechana, on the 3rd of Adar. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsors, Saeed and Sima Haken, in memory of Mrs. Ida Nabazni, mother of Barry Nabazni, whose shiva is being observed now. We hope that in the merits of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamas will have an aliyah and the families a nechama. And also with that, let us begin. So a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem, a beautiful daf ahead of us, a lot of very interesting halacha. So we are picking up, so today's daf is Pevav 86, and we are picking up Emir Hashem on the bottom of Pei Mebeis 85b, 3 lines up from the bottom. So if you remember again, the Mishnah towards the middle of Pei Amud Beis spoke about the concept of Yotzei. So remember, we spoke about this idea yesterday. We spoke about a lagabe tuma, that if you have a piece of carbon that goes out, right, that it goes out of the area where it's supposed to be consumed. Obviously, that area is dependent on the carbon. What's the status of the carbon? So now, without getting into halachas of tuma, the Mishnah just discusses the idea that if you have a piece of carbon Pesach and a limb, right, a limb extends out, or part of a limb extends out of the walls of Yerushalayim, so the meat that's on that bone becomes disqualified. And again, the Mishnah went through the process of going and peeling back the bone, cutting the bone off at the joint because you can't crack the bone, so on and so forth. We'll say the Mishnah then got into a discussion about doorways. In other words, interestingly enough, I know anything inside of the wall is Yerushalayim. I know anything outside of the wall is outside of Yerushalayim. The interesting question that comes up is, what's the status of the stuff in the wall? So if you remember again, the Mishnah spoke about the agov. The agov is the doorway, right? It's the area when the door is closed, that's the area that the door occupies. So the Mishnah said that from the doorway in is Yerushalayim, from the doorway out is outside of Yerushalayim. So again, this yielded a little bit of confusion about the doorway itself. We spoke about that yesterday. Then the Mishnah ends off, and this is what we're going to focus on today. The chalonos, the windows, and the thickness of the wall are considered to be like the interior of Yerushalayim. So windows and actual thickness of the wall is like the inside of Yerushalayim. Good. Says the Gemara, chalonos v'aveichoma amarav gagin ve'aliyos lonis kachu. So it's an interesting statement. Rav says rooftops and upper stories were not sanctified. Now look at Rashi for just a moment. It's about 6 lines up, 7 lines up from the bottom of Rashi. Gagin v'aliyos lonis kachu. Ben gage Yerushalayim b'kedushas Yerushalayim b'kachim kalim. Ben gage lishkos hazara b'kedushas hazara b'kedushas kachim kedushin. So we'll say this has 2 ramifications. So rooftops and upper stories are not holy, which means we'll say 2 things. Let's say kachim kalim, for example. Greatest example of kachim kalim, Karban Pesach. Right? So we'll say, so now where do you have to eat Karban Pesach? You have to eat Karban Pesach in Yerushalayim. So when Rav says that upper stories and rooftops are not sanctified, what that means is you must eat your Karban Pesach on a ground level in Yerushalayim. You can't eat your Karban Pesach in an upper story or on a rooftop, because upper stories and rooftops do not have Kedushas Yerushalayim. Furthermore, in the Beis HaMikdash itself, any carbon that has to be eaten within the precincts of the Beis HaMikdash, which is Kodshe Kadoshim, must be eaten on the ground level, cannot be eaten on a rooftop or on an upper story. Okay, interesting idea. Says the Gemara, is that so? But say, listen to how beautiful this is. Say, this might be one of the most beautiful lines you will ever see in your life. So Rav said in the name of Rav Chia, that eating a kezaisa Karban Pesach and saying Hallel on the night of the Seder, Paka Igra. And I will say Paka Igra literally means causes the roof to explode. Now what does that mean? Look at Rashi. Hallel Paka Igra. Lekol Hamulas Hamon Mehalal. Domin Kilo Agagin Mispakin. And I will say on Pesach night in Yerushalayim, everybody would be singing Hallel at their Seder. And when you would hear everybody singing Hallel, it was like the roof was ready to explode. So we'll say, so what does that mean? What does that mean? So the Gemara says, my love, top of Pevav, my love, the achli be'igra, va'amri be'igra. Rabbi say, does it not mean that they were eating the Karban Pesach on the rooftops and saying Hallel on the rooftops? To which the Gemara says, Lo, the achli ba'ara va'amri be'igra. No, they would eat the Karban Pesach inside the house. Rabbi say, listen to or paint for yourself this image. They would then go up to their rooftops to say Hallel. Say, can you imagine this scene? You're in Yerushalayim on Pesach, you eat your Karban Pesach, and then everybody goes up to their rooftops to sing Hallel from their rooftops. That was Pesach night in Yerushalayim. You could imagine such a thing like this. So everywhere you turn, you see mishpachos, you see chaburos singing Hallel from their rooftops in Yerushalayim. Eretz Hashem will be zocha to see it soon. So Ini the Gemara says, is this so? So in other words, can you do that? You eat Karban Pesach inside the house and go say Hallel on the upper story? On the rooftop, Vatanan, we learned in Maftirin Achara Pesach Hafikomon, you can't go and eat anything after the Karban Pesach. Va'amrav shelo yakro mechabura lechabura. And Rav said that also means you can't go from one group to another group. So Rabbi say bepashtos, what that also means is you don't switch your location over the course of Pesach night. So what do you mean you're eating your Karban Pesach in the house and you're going up to Hallel, going to the rooftop for Hallel? That doesn't seem to be appropriate. In other words, Pesach is the Pesach night, the Seder experience should be observed in one location. To which the Gemara says, Lokashya, kan b'shas achila, kan shelo b'shas achila. No. When you go ahead and you're eating, so eating should not take place in two locations. We're actually going to discuss that. That's our next Mishnah. Eating has to take place in one location. But halacha l'maisa, once you finish eating, you could go to the rooftop for Hallel. So we'll say that seems to be what they did on Pesach night. They would go ahead and eat their Karban Pesach inside the house, and then they would go ahead and go to the rooftop to recite Hallel from the rooftop. Incredible. So Tashma, Avashal, Omer, Aliyas Beis, Kache, Kadashim, Chamura. So we'll say, so remember, so we're operating now with the statement of Rav, which is that upper stories and rooftops don't have Kedusha. So remember again, that statement is a two-pronged statement. It means anything that has to be consumed in Yerushalayim must be consumed on the ground level of Yerushalayim, not in an upper story or rooftop. And anything that has to be consumed in the Beis Hamikdash, Kache Kadoshim, must be consumed on a ground level, not in an upper story or a rooftop. So as it says in Tashma, Abashal, Omer, Aliyas Beis Kache Kadoshim, Chamra Beis Kache Kadoshim. So Abashal says the upper story of the Kodesh HaKadoshim was even holier than the Kodesh HaKadoshim. How so? Shebeis Kache HaKadoshim Kohen Gadol nichnas lo pam achos b'shana. Because in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Kohen Gadol would go in there once a year on Yom Kippur. Ba'aliyah space Kache Kadoshim, but the upper story of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, ein nichnasin lo ela pam achas b'shavua. They would only go into once a Shemitah, once every 7 years. The Gemara says, "V'amila pamayim b'shavua." Some say twice every 7 years. V'amrile pam achas b'yovel. Some say only once every 50 years. Why? Leida mahitzricha. So what's very interesting? So what would happen is, remember the Kodesh Kadoshim was very tall. It had an incredible ceiling height. So the Gemara is saying over here is they would only go in there as a machlokas once every 7 years, twice every 7 years, once every 50 years. The point is they would go in there very infrequently to see if any repairs were necessary. That was now. What does this sound like? The fact that they weren't going in there every single year. Why? Because it had kedusha. So you see from here that even upper stories in the Beis Hamikdash do have kedusha, not like Rav said, to which the Gemara says, Rav Yosef mehechol nekom v'nesiv inish. You can't bring a raya over here from the height of the Beis Hamikdash. That's not a fair statement. The Gemara says, Shiny heichol dichsiv vayitin David l'shlomo beno estavnis ha'ulam v'esbatav v'guz zachav v'aliosav v'chadarav hapnimim u'beis ha'kaboros uksiv hakol b'ksav miyat Hashem alay haskil. Also, you can't bring a raya from the dimensions of the Kodesh itself. Why? Because those dimensions were directly handed from David to Shlomo and were given from HaKadosh Baruch Hu to David HaMelech. So when we talk about the fact that in the Beis Hamikdash, the upper stories, right, the upper stories and rooftops don't have Kedusha, that's talking about, also remember again, we've seen this, the Beis Hamikdash itself was a massive compound. we're not referring to over here what we call the Kodesh, right? Most remember again, the Kodesh was like a T-like structure. You entered into the Ulam, which was a large antechamber, and then you walked into a more narrow Kodesh. That area contained the Shulchan, the Mizbeach, the menorah. You walked a little bit further, you hit the parochas, the curtain, and then behind that Kodesh Kodashim. That area, those dimensions were given by a Kodesh Baruch Hu. So of course, again, that rooftop and those ceilings or those upper stories, of course, do have Kedushas HaMikdash. When Rav said before that upper stories and rooftops don't have Kedusha in the Beis HaMikdash, that's really talking about the rest of the Beis HaMikdash compound. So also, remember again, we've seen there are so many other chambers in the Beis HaMikdash. Those are not from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Those were created ultimately again when they built the Beis HaMikdash. Though the ground level there has Kedusha, but upper stories and rooftops do not. Pretty incredible. Tashma, Halishkos, Habenuyos, Bakodesh. We'll say another interesting statement. So we're still continuing with the statement of Rav. Lishkos, we'll say chambers. So chambers, Habenuyos, Bakodesh. So if you have chambers that are built in a sanctified area of the Beis HaMikdash, upsuchos lechol, but they open up to unconsecrated area, tochan chol, bigago sein kodesh. The interior of those chambers are considered to be unsanctified, but their rooftops are kodesh. One second, rooftops kodesh. Rav, you just told me before that rooftops of temple chambers are not kodesh. Tirgamarav chista, bishegago sein shavin the karka azara. Oh. Well, so what are we talking about over here? These are subterranean chambers. So their actual rooftops are actually level with what? With the ground of the Azara. Okay, so the ground, so therefore again, if your rooftop is level with the ground of the Azara, the ground of the courtyard, then of course, again, the rooftops have Kedusha. If that's the case, look at the Seifa. What happens if you have these chambers that are built in unconsecrated areas, but they open up to consecrated areas? Tochan Kodesh vegago sehen chol. Their interior is Kodesh, but their rooftops are chol. But one second. Sorry, ultimately again, but if you hold that halacha lemaisa, their rooftops are equal, right? Are flush, whatever, are level with the Azar. So their rooftop is really ground level. Mechilos. And ultimately, again, these chambers actually have the status also of mechilos, of tunnels. We've seen this before. Rabbi Yochanan, mechilos lonis kanshu. Tunnels in the temple compound were not sanctified. And I will say, this is actually very interesting. Remember, we've seen this before. The Gemara says they had a tunnel system. One of the reasons they had a tunnel system, well, Shlomo HaMelech built a tunnel system as an escape route. But there was also a tunnel system because remember, they used this when? Right, so when a coin would become Tameh, simple case, coin becomes a Baal Keri, has a seminal mission. How do you get him out? Right? How do you go ahead? Remember, everything's Kodesh. So remember, the tunnel system was not sanctified. That allowed a Kohen to effectively get out of the Beis Hamikdash without having to further spend time in consecrated area. So the Gemara says, Mechilos lo neskachu, Hikam Rabbi Yochanan bepsuchos laharabayis, Hitanya bepsuchos lahazar. Supposed to say everything depended ultimately again on where the tunnels or subterranean chambers opened. If the subterranean chambers opened to harabayis, then halacha lamaisa again, then einachinami, the mechilos, the tunnel, subterranean chamber would not be kodesh. But if it opened up into the Azara, then ultimately, again, it would be Kodesh. If you take a look at Rashi, Rashi says, B'psuchos harabayis, the gabi shiluach bal keri. This is what we just mentioned. Hamishtalech chutz harabayis, amru be'ilo divarim, the kamer mechilos on his katshu, ubal keri mishtalech chutz l'shtei machanos, umutali kanos mechilos harabayis. So if the mechila, literally the tunnel, the subterranean chamber opens into the harabayis, then the interior of the chamber does not have Kedusha. However, Yahahi, Rashi says, the Tochan Kodesh Bepsuchos La'azara. But however, so we'll say, so essentially, simply put, the status of the interior of the subterranean chamber is fundamentally dependent on where the chamber opens to. If the chamber opens to a consecrated area, then the interior is Kodesh. If the chamber opens into an unconsecrated area, then the interior is not Kodesh. Tanya, we learned Rabbi Huda Omer Mechilos mitachas ha'hechal chol. Yet Rabbi Huda said that the tunnels underneath the Heichal were all unconsecrated. So Rabbi say, Ki tanyahi shepsuchos l'chol. Okay, true. It could very well be that a good number of the tunnels were chol, but I will say when it comes to this, is just a fact. When it comes to determining the status of the interior of a particular subterranean tunnel or subterranean chamber in the base of Mikdash compound, the status of that tunnel / chamber is fundamentally dependent on where it opens to. If it opens to Harabayis, meaning outside of the Beis HaMikdash compound, it's Chol. If it opens into the Azara, courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, it is Kodesh. Another case, Tashma, the Gago Kodesh. So I will say the pasuk says, the one quoting over here, the Gago Kodesh, it's rooftop, right? This is what we just said in the Brisa. This rooftop is Kodesh. It is Bra. V'hakatani gagna lalo ein ochlin sham kadshe kadoshim, vein shochtim sham kadshim kalim. But we said elsewhere, we said that the rooftops of the chambers in the Beis Hamikdash compound, you can't eat kadshe kadoshim there, and you can't shecht kadshim kalim there. So we see again that rooftops are not kodesh. Again, kind of affirming what Rav said before on Pehei Amud Beis. And the Bryce also supporting this idea. So what's going on? So, I'm sorry. So the Bryce has said that the Gag is Kodesh. But yet we learn elsewhere that you can't shecht Kodshim Kalim and you can't eat Kodshe Kadoshim on the rooftops in the Beis HaMikdash compound. So what's going on over here? Velakashya Gago Kodesh Amrav Khan Bar Guya Laosan Beis Amos. Rabbi say this is absolutely incredible. No. When we say that the rooftops are Kodesh, or that the upper chambers are Kodesh, we're talking about for different things. So I will say, right now, where we're coming from is like this. Everyone will agree that in the Beis HaMikdash compound, upper chambers and rooftops, you cannot go ahead and use it in any type of sacrificial capacity. So, for example, you can't shecht kadshe kadoshim there, and you can't eat you can't shecht kadshim kalim on upper stories, upper chambers, or rooftops. You can't eat kadshe kadosh. So nothing sacrificial can be done in upper chambers or rooftops in the Beis HaMikdash. When the Brisa said that the upper chambers are Kodesh, what it means is you are allowed to store there certain building utensils or certain types of service utensils for the Beis HaMikdash. So it could be used, interestingly enough, as consecrated storage. As consecrated storage, incredible. So specifically what? The Beis Amos. So we'll say the Beis Amos, as we're going to see in just a moment now, are the 2 amma measurements. If you take a look at Rashi, Rashi says over here, La'osan shtei amas, La'hachi kadshe gagin, L'shimush nesinas klei kodesh, Hatzrichen lebinyan. See, I both saying, you can't do anything sacrificial in the upper stories or rooftops in the Beis HaMikdash, but what you can do is store utensils necessary for building. Avalo atzricha lemizbeach kede ashkechan she'osen shtei amos maklo shalmida hayu nesunas begova hashar shuhu begagin rabalius. So this is very interesting. Now remember, there's the only type of utensils you're allowed to store there in the upper stories, the upper chambers or rooftops are building utensils. You can't store service utensils there. So what we call klei shares, which are utensils used in karbanos, right, for sacrificial service. That you can't store there, but the upper stories can be used to store building utensils. I will say, listen to how incredible this is and watch the timing. Isnan, Beis Amis Hayu B'Shushan Habira. Incredible. The two, now I will say Beis Amis, but it doesn't mean 2 Amis. Beis Amis means they were like 2 1 Amma, what's the right word? Like rulers, if that's the right word, right? Two 1 Amma rulers. You'll see why I need 2 1 Amma rulers in just a moment. And they were stored in Shushan Habira. That will say, now what's Shushan Habira? Look at Rashi. Rashi says, Shtei Amas Kane Amida, 2 rulers that each measured an Amma. Hayu b'Shushan Habira. V'bayis habanu agova hashar. Kedesam Meseches Midas. Shar HaMizrachi va'alav Shushan Habira. We'll say, on the eastern gate of the Beis HaMikdash, there was a turret. We'll say, a turret. And the turret was called Shushan Habira. Shushan, the capital city. And why was it called Shushan Habira? Listen to how beautiful this is. He says, Va'alav Shushan Habira Tsura Mitzuyeres. There was a mural of the city of Shushan painted on this turret on the eastern entranceway of the Beis HaMikdash. Umefarshinan bemenachos kedei sheyedu mehechan bo ulahachi hu dekach. Supposed to listen to this. Why do they have a mural of Shushan Abira? Why a turret? Let's say it's two things. Number one, on a most basic level, it was Hakaras Hatov to the Persians. Right? It was Hakaras Hatov to the Persian Median Empire. Remember again, it was Koresh, it was Cyrus who allowed for the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash. So again, it was Hakaras Hatov that they allowed ultimately to go ahead and come into, that they allowed them to rebuild. That was number one. But also the words of Rashi are so profound. In life, you always have to know where you come from. You have to know where you come from. And why do you have to know where you come from? Because I was saying, if there's one, we all come from different places and we all have different backgrounds. But I would venture to say if there's one common denominator in our familial history, it's Mesiras Nefesh. Every family has its story of self-sacrifice. And it is incredibly important to know that you are only here because someone before you sacrificed something dramatic. So if you think about this, when you walked into the Beis Hamikdash and the first thing you saw was Shushan Habira, what did you remember? You remember there was once an Esther Amalka who was a simple young woman who gave up everything for Klal Yisrael. And you remember there was a Mordechai Tzaddik who was willing to put everything on the line, ultimately for Klal Yisrael. Things don't just happen. And what we have in life is because someone was willing to give everything for something bigger than themselves. We kind of often just roll out of bed and think that everything is just here. And maybe it's because our lives, Baruch Hashem, are a little bit easier. That for many of us, we don't really have all that much Mesiras Nefesh, right? Let's say, if we're honest, for many of us, our greatest Mesiras Nefesh, to be honest, is like getting up early in the morning. But there's not that much other Mesiras Nefesh that we often have in this world. We don't really have to be Moser Nefesh for our Yiddishkeit because Baruch Hashem, we live in blessed times. So what are we Moser Nefesh for? Okay, maybe for Parnas you have to be Moser Nefesh for. Okay, but understand, even if you're not being Moser Nefesh for anything, someone before you was Moser Nefesh. You had to know that. You had to know that incredible Gemara. So we'll say, so what happened in the Shushan Abira? So what happens in the Shushan? So we'll say, it's very interesting. What did they store in Shushan Abira? They stored two rulers. Each ruler measured an amma. So the Gemara says, Beis Amis Hayu B'Shushan Abira, Achas Al Kerem Mizrachas Tzfonis. One was in the northeast corner, and one was in the southeast corner. V'achas Al Kerem Mizrachas Deromis. Zu Sha'al Kerem Mizrachas Tzfonis. Ha'isi Yisera Al Moshe Chatzi Etzba. So we'll say, there was the amma of Moshe. The amma of Moshe, of course, is 6 Tvachim. They had two rulers. One ruler was a half a finger larger than the Amma of Moshe. That was in the northeast corner. And the ruler in the southeast corner was another half finger larger than that. So what's very interesting? The two rulers. The ruler in the northeast corner was a half a finger larger or longer than the Amma of Moshe. The one in the southeast corner was an additional half a finger larger than that. So effectively, it was 1 finger larger than the Amma of Moshe. So we'll say, so why do they have this? Why did they need one that was larger than the other? The Gemara is supposed to listen to this. This is incredible. If you were an what's the right word? Not contractor, right? So if you were a contractor doing work for the Beis Hamikdash, you're supposed to listen to how this happened. When you got your price for your job, the price you gave was based on the smaller amma. But when you delivered the final product, you had to deliver based on what? On the larger amma. Now, why did they do this? So the Gemara says, Kadesh lo yavo lidei me'ila. Now, they did this in order that no one should come to Me'ilah. So you contracted the job at the smaller Amma. That's what you would get paid based on. But you would deliver based on the larger Amma, ultimately, again, to avoid Me'ilah. So the Gemara says, still, but why do I need two? Why do I need two? Why one that was half a finger, one that was a whole finger? The kaspa v'dava, achas kaspa v'dava, achas lebinyana. One ultimately, again, was for gold and silver, and one was for general building materials. So for gold and silver, they would only use the amma measure that was a half a finger larger than Moshe's. And ultimately, again, for other building materials, which are not expensive, they used the one that was a full finger larger. Again, I want to point out something amazing over here. What you see from here also is that building for the Beis Hamikdash was not a for-profit venture, right? Why did you build for the Beis Hamikdash? Say you built for the Beis Hamikdash. Why? It was a privilege to be selected to build for the Beis Hamikdash. And I will say, what an incredible paradigm for involvement in klal and communal work. It is a privilege to serve. It is a privilege to serve a gila. It's a privilege to serve a privilege to be involved. Very often we're very utilitarian in like what we get involved in. Which is natural. We usually have this approach in most things, like what's in it for me? What do I get out of it? So what's this? You can imagine here's a craftsman, a contractor. He could be building whatever it is, and here he's going to build to the base of English. And I will say, bepashtos, not even at a break even. Bepashtos, he's probably even going to take a loss. Why would anyone ever take a job in which they're going to be at a loss? It's a privilege to serve, because it is a privilege to be involved in building something that is bigger than you. Because those who go ahead and just spend their lives building up themselves end up with a gaping hole inside of their neshama. But those who, yes, build themselves, but also find the time and find the resources to build something bigger than themselves, even though it doesn't fill up one's pocket, that's where true fulfillment in life comes from. An incredible yisod. So the Gemara goes weiter. Tanan, hachalonos v'achama kilifnim. So as we learned in the Mishnah, on our Mishnah, so we'll say, so therefore again, what you see over here is, I just want to point out, it's all dramatic, what you see over here is Rav's statement. This all comes back to Rav's statement. And Rav's statement was that halacha l'maisa, upper stories and rooftops are not kodesh. They're not consecrated, they're not sanctified. That's true in the city of Yerushalayim, and it's true in the Beis HaMikdash compound as well. Now the Mishnah said, so windows, right, the width of windows and the width of the wall are considered to be like the interior of Yerushalayim. This was our Mishnah on Pehei days. I understand the windows because also you could have a window that is like a floor, we'll call it like a floor to ceiling window, or a window that begins at the floor and goes up. So I understand when you tell me that the window itself is considered to be like the interior. As the Gemara says, the shavi lakarka azara. What's the case of the thickness of the wall? To which the Gemara says is actually very interesting. Look at Rashi. Oviachama, rosh hachoma niskadsha dedamu legagim lechos. So we'll say, when we talk about the thickness of the wall, so bepashtos, when is the thickness of the wall usable? When you're on top of the wall. So on top of the wall, so now you're telling me that the top of the wall has the status of the interior of Yerushalayim, that the top of the wall has the status of the interior of the Beis HaMikdash. So then obviously the tops, the upper areas, are kodesh. This is actually very interesting. Gemara says no. In Mishkachasla bebar shura. We'll say bar shura, interestingly enough, means a lower wall. But what it really means is actually very interesting, is a retaining wall. We'll say, so remember again, so just if you're, any time that you're building on a slope, so often you have to go ahead and you have to build a retaining wall, right? To kind of build out, I don't know what the technical terms are, but to build out, simplest example we'll say is the Beis HaMikdash. When you go to the Kosel today, so if you daven by the Kosel, you're not davening by a wall of the Beis HaMikdash. That's not, I don't mean to, right? That's not a wall of the Beis HaMikdash. That is the remainder of a retaining wall that Herod built. So remember again, the Harabayis is a har, it's a mountain. It's difficult to build on a mountain because you only have a very small amount of area. What did Herod do? It's amazing what he did. He trucked in probably tons and tons of dirt, built retaining walls around the Harabayis, filled in the entire area with dirt, and leveled it out. Let's say that's why if you ever go, let's say to Har HaZeisim, and you look down on Harabayis, you'll notice the topography of Harabayis does not make sense with the surrounding areas, right? What's Harabayis? What's on Harabayis now? It's like a big, flat rectangle. Doesn't make any sense. Everything else around it is mountains and valleys. How is it that there is this huge rectangle in the middle of Yerushalayim? The answer is because it was artificially made. That's thanks to Herod. I mean, after he wiped out the entire Sanhedrin, right? But again, he felt bad. This is what happened. He felt bad. So he goes ahead and he builds. So let's say, so what we have with the Kosel today is one of the remaining retaining walls. So the Gemara says perhaps the case of the top of a wall which is kodesh is a retaining wall. Because we'll say what happens with a retaining wall? The top of a retaining wall is often flush with what? With what? With the ground. That's the top of a wall. Ultimately, again, that has the status of the Beis Hamikdash. So that's the top of the wall that has the status of Yerushalayim. The Gemara just supports this. Shura bar shura. Quotes over here the pasuk from Eicha, and the pasuk says that literally again the chel and the choma will both go ahead and mourn. What's the chel and the choma? The choma is a wall. What's the chel? The chel is a retaining. Good. So I'll say. So it turns out that bottom line halacha lemaisa, the Gemara does accept the position of Rav, which is really quite fascinating, which tells us that rooftops and upper chambers in Yerushalayim do not have the holiness of Yerushalayim, and in the Beis Hamikdash do not have the holiness of the Mikdash, which tells me that in Yerushalayim, Karban Pesach must be, where it's very interesting, must be eaten on the ground floor, which is interesting because when Mashiach comes, there's a lot of apartment buildings in Yerushalayim. It'll be very interesting to see what Eliyahu Navi is going to tell us to do. So if you live in an apartment building, where do you eat your Karban Pesach? The Pashtas, it's not clear. But at least according to the Gemara here, ground level. Beis Hamikdash, upper stories, rooftops do not have kedusha, therefore can't eat kachim kalim there, can't shecht kachim kadashim. What can it be used for? Storage of building utensils. Incredible, says the Mishnah. If you have two chaburas that were eating in one home, I will say what this literally means is as follows. We're going to see what this really means is you have one group for Karban Pesach, one chevra, one chabura. They went into a home and effectively divided into two groups. So they have one Karban Pesach, one group. They started off as one group. They go into them, they divide off into two groups. So shtei chabura she'ochlen b'isachad. Elu hofchines peneim helech va'ochlen ve'elu hofchines peneim helech va'ochlen. So also what the Mishnah essentially says is, even if you start off as one chabura, if you enter into a home and want to split off into two chaburas, that's fine. That's fine. To the point that even they look like two chaburas, right? Chevra 1 goes over here, they turn their heads in this direction. Chevra 2 goes over there, they turn their heads in a second direction, that's okay. Even if the hot water urn is in the middle. And I will say, what is the hot water urn? That's how they would dilute their wine, right? So they would take some wine concentrate, you'd have the hot water. So the hot water urn in the middle there is another physical barrier, physical separation. So when the shamish goes, now we'll say, now there was a waiter. Now the waiter usually was he was also a guy who was part of one of the chaburas, a Jewish waiter. He's part of one of the chaburas. We'll say, so the waiter has to get up from his chabura and go over to the other chabura. But when he does so, he must make sure to keep his mouth closed, right? Literally keep his mouth closed. And after he finishes, so we'll say, let's say, for example, the shamish is part of chabura A. So now he's got to serve chabura B also. When he gets up and goes over there, he should keep his mouth closed. Now, why should he keep his mouth closed? Because as we're going to see, we don't want it to look like that he's eating Karban Pesach in two places. Right? So he has to keep his mouth closed, and as soon as he finishes serving Chabura B, he should turn his head back in the direction of his own Chabura. Va'ochel. Va'akalo chofeches es panaha va'ocheles. And a kalo, if she's embarrassed. Rashi points out over here, this is like a Cheva Brachas. Everybody looks at the kalo. The kalo may feel self-conscious about eating. She could turn away and eat private. Now we'll see exactly what the ramifications of that halacha actually are. So we'll say what comes out from this Mishnah is a very important principle, which is that you could have one large chabura, and that chabura is permitted to split off into smaller chaburas. That's the idea of the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, Masnisin money. Whose opinion is our Mishnah? Rabbi Hudahi, the Sanya, alabatim asher yochlu oso bahem. So what does it mean? Alabat asher yochlu oso bahem. Melamed shapesach nechal b'shtei chaburas. It teaches me that halacha l'maisa Pesach can be in two groups. Now, say, look at Rashi. Alabatim asher yochlu oso mashma shnei bnei adam ochlen Pesach echad b'shtei batim dichsev yochlu shnayim oso char Pesach. So also what this tells you is that halacha l'maisa you could have a group that was one cohesive group for Karban Pesach, and then at the time of consumption, they choose to eat in two locations. So the chiddush being that one carbon pesach can be consumed in two locations. However, you might have thought that one person could eat in two locations. No, that you can't do. Talmud Lomar, therefore the pasuk says, in one home it shall be eaten. This is very important. This is Shitas Rabbi Huda. Rabbi Huda holds that halacha l'maisa, you can have one chabura split into two chaburas, divide up the carbon pesach, and eat the same carbon in two different locations. That's okay. What can't you have? What can't you have? You can't have one person eating in two locations. So if the chabura wants to split into two, that's fine. You got to choose a team, right? You got to choose. You have to either be with A or B. You can't eat. So again, I will say here, you could take one carbon, split it into two, and eat it in two locations. Either that's two actual locations or just two chaburas in one home. But halacha l'maisa, every person must choose a location. You can't have one person eating in two homes. A number from here, we said, if the shamish ate the kazayis of Korban Pesach by the side of the oven, so if he's a smart guy, he better eat his fill where he is, because he can't subsequently go to eat anywhere else. And if the other members of the chabura want to be nice to him, they could come sit next to him. Rabbi Yehuda. Supposed to these words Rabbi Yehuda. Supposed to Rabbi Yehuda holds that halacha l'maisa, one chabura could split off into two and eat in two different locations. That's okay. But one person cannot eat in two locations. Chabura could split, but everybody has to choose one location where they're going to eat the Korban Pesach. Shimon says, we'll say the opposite. This is incredible. Alabatim asher yochlu osabahem. What does it mean, the homes in which you will eat in it? Malamed sha'ochel ochel b'shnei mekomos. Wow. Rabbi Shimon says one person could eat in two locations. One person could eat in two locations. Amud Beis yochel yeinema lechal b'shnei chaburos. So you might have thought that's what that halacha l'maisa the Pesach can be eaten in two chaburos. Talmud Lomar bebayis echad ye'ochel. The pasuk says, in one home it shall be eaten. The pasuk says, now watch this. Comes along Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Shimon says like this, just the opposite. He says, carbon Pesach could only be eaten in one location. You can't divide a carbon amongst two locations. One carbon, one location. But what can happen? One individual, once the carbon has a set location, then what Rabbi say? Then what? One person could eat in multiple locations. Fascinating. So Rabbi Yehuda is saying, the carbon itself can be divided amongst two locations, but every person must choose a location. One person can't eat in more than one location. Rabbi Shimon says just the opposite. The carbon must have one address. But once the carbon has one address, any individual member of the chabura could eat in more than one location. But Mike, if to get about what are they arguing about? Rabbi Yehuda Savar Yesh was the third line down, Pei Vavam days. Rabbi Yehuda holds Yesh Ein Lamasoras. Rabbi Shimon Savar Yesh Ein Lamikra. Both what are they arguing about? The both said this. We see this machlok is very often Yesh Ein Lamasoras. Yesh Ein Lamikra means when you look at a particular word, is the word darshan based on how it's written, or is the word darshan based on how it's said? So both say very simply put, just because of time, the pasuk says Bebayis echad yeyachel. The both say is yeyachel or yochal. Ultimately, again, is that referring to the Korban Pesach, or is that referring to the individual? When it says bayis echad yochal or bayis echad yeachel, in one home it shall be eaten, that's a reference. If you hold yeachel, that it should ultimately again be looked at as to ultimately again how it is written. So bayis echad yochal, that halacha l'maisa again, every reference to the individual. Right, the individual can only eat in one home, as opposed to ye'achel. Ultimately, again, Rabbi Shimon will say the carbon itself must be only eaten in one home, but the individual could eat in as many homes as he would like. So, I will say this is the fundamental machlokas, Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda, and all based on how you've dashed in the word ye'achel. Essentially, is it a reference to the individual or is it a reference to the carbon? When it says it shall be eaten in one home, is the one home halacha on the individual or the one home halacha on the carbon? Rabbi Shimon will say the one home halacha is on the carbon. The carbon must have a home, must have one address. You can't divide up a carbon, one address. Once the carbon has one address, the individual members of the chabura could eat wherever they want. Rabbi Yehuda will say no, just the opposite. The carbon could actually have more than one address, but the individual could only eat in one location. Dramatic machlokes. So listen to this interesting case. Let's say there's one chabura. Listen to this case. One chabura, one group of guys sitting together. One group. And what happens? And then somebody puts up a mechitza. Always that guy who has to put up a mechitza. Right? So what happens? The chabura is sitting and they put up a mechitza amongst the group. So now what's the shaila? Does the placement of the mechitza disrupt the chabura? So now watch this. The divrei omer pesach nechal b'shtei chaburos. According to Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that no problem, one pesach, one carbon could be divided up amongst two chaburos. Ochlin, the emergence of a mechitza is not a big deal. So if you can imagine, if watch this case. Let's say we're all one chabur eating carbon pesach together, and some guy decides he learned a new chumrah. He places the mechitza right down the middle over here. So does that shter our consumption of carbon pesach? So according to Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that halacha lemaisa, one chabur could split off into two chaburas in order to pesach can be eaten in two locations. The appearance of the mechitza does not share the consumption of the carbon pesach. However, the divrei omer, this is Rabbi Shimon, the divrei omer, eina pesach nechal b'shtei chaburos, ein ochlin. But according to Rabbi Shimon, who holds, Rabbi say that what? One carbon cannot be consumed in two locations, right? The carbon pesach must have an address. Then what? Then ultimately, again, ein ochlin. Then ein ochinami halacha l'maisa. You could not continue eating the carbon pesach. Pretty incredible. Similarly, the reverse case. Yoshev and Rabbi say, let's say you have two chaburas eating in one location with a mechitza between them. The mechitza separating the two chaburas. What happens? The divrei omer ochel b'shtei makomos, according to the opinion who said that an individual could eat in more than one location, then ochlim, then it's fine. Because Rabbi say, what happens now? With the removal of the mechitza, suddenly again, I'm eating in a new location. According to Rabbi Shimon, who holds that halacha l'maisa, you could eat a carbon pesach in more than one location, that an individual could eat in multiple locations, not a problem. But according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that halacha l'maisa, you can't eat in more than one location, the removal of the mechitza would actually preclude you from continuing to eat your carbon pesach. The boss is actually pretty incredible. Yosef Rav Kana kapashat le'mifshat. Rav Kana said this kind of as just a davar pashat, as a declarative statement. It was pashat, or as in Rav Kahana's version, there was no machlokes about this. Amalei Rav Ashi Rav Kana biti bailacha. But it's not a statement. It's a kasha that the Gemara said. Tibailacha ibai silik mechitza basias mechitza mehavi kabeis makomos ukabeis chaburos. Does the placement of the mechitza or the removal of the mechitza make it into two chaburos or one chaburos? And ultimately, again, and the answer is teku. We're not sure. So Rabbi say the way the Gemara ends off over here is a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi. I just want to point out this is such an incredibly profound yesodistic machlokes. According to Rabbi Yehuda holds bebayis echad yachel is a din in the individual. When I eat carbon pesach, I must eat carbon pesach in one location. One location. Now, the carbon itself could be divided. So if we're all one big chabura and we decide, we don't all want to eat together, you could divide the pesach into two, right? And each chabura will go on its own. But you must choose a place to have your carbon pesach, and you cannot eat your carbon pesach in two locations. Right? Rabbi Shimon says, no, the carbon itself must have one address. One address. There's no such thing as dividing up a carbon amongst the chabura into two. The carbon itself must have one address, and that is it. Now, once the carbon has one address, interestingly enough, what could happen after that? Individuals could then go ahead and eat at multiple locations. It's quite fascinating. That's machlokes. So we'll say we're going to see the Rambam paskins like Rabbi Yehuda, namely that one chabura could dividing the carbon between them, but halacha l'maisa, you cannot eat your carbon in multiple locations. You can only consume your carbon pesach in one address. Halacha l'maisa, we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. Let's go back to Rabbi just for another minute. Ta'akalo fechas panel. I will say, so the kala could turn away while eating. Now I will say, now lav dafku that this is a din in carbon pesach, but this just seems to be a general din in meal etiquette, but by carbon pesach as well. Why? So the Gemara says, "My time Rabbi Abba, Rabbi Yochanan, mipnei shibosha." because the Kala is embarrassed. She's the center of attention, and she wants to eat. But she doesn't want to eat with everybody looking at her, so she could turn away. So the Gemara said, Rav Huna bar Rav Nasan, Ikol Rav Nachman. So this is a great story. Great story. So Rav Huna bar Rav Nasan went to the house of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. So Amrulei Mashmecha. So they said to him, "What's your name? What's your name?" He said, My name, Amrullahu Rav Huna. He said, my name is Rav Huna. Now, I want to point out something very interesting over here. Actually, we'll get to it in just a moment. Amrullahu Rav Huna. Amru Meisiv Marapuria. So they invited him to sit down. So Yosef, he sat down. Yavulei Kasa. They gave him something to drink. Kablei Bechad Zimna. So he went ahead and he accepted the offer to drink. The first offer, Vishasi betrays him, and he drank the glass of wine in 2 gulps. Below had their ape, and he did not turn his head away while he drank. Amrulei, my time Rav Huna. So we'll say they were a little surprised at Rav Huna's behavior. You'll see in just a moment why. They said, first of all, why do they call you Rav Huna? Amrullahu Bal Shem Ani. That's my name. Right? Why do they call Rav Huna? That's my name. And I want to point out something very interesting. Look at Rashi. Bal Shem Ana Mekatnusi Kachkorin Rav Huna. Rav say this is incredible. It's such a life-changing Gemara. Throughout my life, learning Gemara, you see Rav Huna, you see what does Rav Huna mean? Rabbi Huna. No, that was his name. They named him Rav. You want to talk about like parental pressure to become something great, right? They named him Rav. They named that was his name, Rav Huna. His name was Rav Huna. So that's my name from the time I was young. My timer. All right, we'll have to stop over here. I'm leaving a little bit of a cliffhanger. It's a great story. We're going to start with this in Mir Hashem tomorrow. We'll finish up the parak in Mir Hashem tomorrow. So we'll say, Yeshakayach.